So thank you for the lovely introduction and also for inviting me to be a part of this lecture series. It's been really lovely coming to Berlin and meeting those involved. We've had a very nice time so far. And thank you also for being here and listening to this during summer. The weather is finally nice and now you are indoors, so I apologize for that. But I hope that this will be interesting enough and then we can go outside. So I'm going to talk about the effects of psychedelics on flexible cognition. This is very broad. I keep it broad for a reason. But these aspects of flexible cognition I'm going to speak about today are creativity and pro-social cognition, so particularly talking about empathy. So before I get into the psychedelic part, actually, what I first want to talk about is creativity. And before I talk about creativity, I actually want to ask you a few questions. Okay? So I'm going to show you a few pictures of people, and I want you to raise your hand if you consider the person associated with that picture to be creative. So, oops. The Beatles. I know the Beatles. Many people, but in general, who considers the Beatles to be creative? Yeah. Steve Jobs? Who considers Steve Jobs to be creative? Yeah. And what about yourself? Who considers themselves to be creative? Okay, yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, nice. About even throughout. Actually, I think I saw the most for Steve Jobs. But it was pretty equal. And that's good. I'm happy to see that. I asked this question a few times now, and what I oftentimes see is a lot of hands for the Beatles and a lot of hands for Steve Jobs and far less hands for ourselves, which I think is a shame because we as a species are creative. We all display certain levels of this ability. And this is important. We've had to be creative in order to be successful as individuals and as a species, right? So creativity is difficult to define, but you can break it down into constructs. And two constructs that give rise to creative cognition are divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So for example, if you're faced with a problem, divergent thinking allows you to come up with possible solutions for that problem. Whereas then convergent thinking, you have to decide what to do, right? You have to act. This is a more logical evaluation. And through this process, you are able to come up with creative ideas, novel, useful ideas, and solve everyday problems you may face. Examples include creating tools to be more efficient, or the more modern, far less dramatic example of just trying to figure out how to get home when your car is broken down. So this is all part of creative cognition underlies all of these problem-solving abilities as well. And here there is a bit of a dilemma in that individuals with disorders like depression, anxiety, PTSD demonstrate deficits in creative flexible thinking. So individuals are characterized by very repetitive, rigid, compulsive thoughts, which can give rise to maladaptive behaviors. And this deficit in creative flexible thinking has been suggested to be a transdiagnostic process. So this means a risk or maintaining factor shared across different disorders. So some have suggested if you can enhance creativity, this might be a potentially useful therapeutic intervention in that if you could break individuals out of their rigid maladaptive thoughts, you could perhaps promote adaptive interpretations of their current life situations and also maybe help them come up with new, better coping strategies to deal with what they're going through at the moment. And that's where psychedelics may come in. At least that's where my interest comes in. Why do I say this? Well, there's a large number of anecdotal reports from artists, writers, entrepreneurs, perhaps yourself, I won't ask, that claim enhanced creative capacity after psychedelic drug use. So for example, there's a nice quote from Paul McCartney when he was speaking with Rolling Stones about how the Beatles reportedly utilized what they experienced when they used LSD. And he said that LSD started to find its way into everything we did. It colored our perceptions. I think we started to realize there weren't as many frontiers as we thought there were. We realized we could break barriers, so they could step outside of the box with their music. That's all well and good. I think it's very interesting, but for me, more interesting are the growing number of patient reports. So reports from patients who are participating in clinical trials with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for these range of disorders that are characterized by reductions in creativity. Are you all familiar with the ongoing psychedelic trial? Should I sum it up? Or? Yeah, so in some, there's a growing number of trials demonstrating that a 1 or 2 time administration of a psychedelic in combination with some form of therapeutic aid induces very rapid and persisting symptomatic relief. And when you speak to these patients, they report that they're able to break out of their rigid maladaptive thought patterns. They experience insights into their personal circumstances, and they're able to view their circumstances from a different perspective. And importantly, they claim therapeutic relief from these experiences. So that made us at Maastricht University very interested to see what's going on here. Are psychedelics doing what everybody says they're doing? So we started trying to investigate this observationally. So in the wild, taking advantage of the fact that people are using these drugs. Oftentimes they're using them together in groups, which is even better for us because we only have to go to so many retreats. And we asked them to very kindly participate in our studies, which include completing our creativity measures, for example, before they take the substance at their ceremony, and then during the psychedelic effects, and then in the days following as well. And here we can start to try to understand if there's any indication that something's changing here. So I'll show you quick results from a study we did where we were visiting ayahuasca ceremonies in South America and asking them to complete our creativity measures before and during their ayahuasca experience. So you may wonder how we measure creativity. So at this study, one of the one of the tests we used was the pattern line meaning test. So here we show pictures like this, like you see here, very abstract. Black lines on a white background, and we ask people to give meaning to these pictures. So what do they see when they look at these pictures? So I'd like to ask you, what do you see when you look at this picture? Would anybody just yell out what they see? A group of people? Yeah. A desk with 4 chairs? Yeah. Yeah, okay, I see it. Anybody else? A notebook. Very academic. You had a desk, a notebook. So do you have any idea how we would assess these responses to be creative? How would we say that a notebook that's a cartoon hand is creative? Yeah, exactly. That's one way, indeed. So fluency, how many responses did they come up with? And then we can also assess originality. So how unique are those responses compared to everybody else? So if I said a notebook and you said a notebook, you would get less of the originality score because we both said it. So I'm going to show you what somebody on ayahuasca said. And we can compare your responses because they saw the same picture. So we showed them 2 pictures. Before ayahuasca, they saw this top left one. And here they said they saw a woman's breasts, definitely. Domes in a desert or flatlands, like those biospheres in the documentaries. 2 bowls on a plate face down. A twin sun is rising on the horizon. So that's before. After ayahuasca, they said, 4 eyes are observing me on top of a metal throne. The 4 circles are revolving. The throne is vibrating with energy, spreading fractal-like stripes to the sphere sitting on it. Usually I get a laugh now. Because you see a difference in response style. We can discuss whether it's more divergent or not, how many responses are in there, how fluent were they. It's definitely unique. Nobody else said this. But throughout the study and with our other tests, we found that during the ayahuasca experience, there was an increase in divergent thinking, so idea generation. So that made us want to go further. always one experiment leads to another. So we said, okay, we have an indication something is changing here other than anecdotal reports. Let's bring it into the lab and administer a psychedelic in an experimental, placebo-controlled manner, you know, the gold standard, and see if psychedelics do enhance or alter creative cognition. If they do, for how long? So is it only acutely? What about in the days following? That's arguably more interesting from a therapeutic standpoint. And also how? What's changing in the brain? So here we invited 60 healthy participants to the lab. 30 received a moderate dose of psilocybin. So yeah, it's about 13 to 15 milligrams. 30 received placebo. And this is a very light schematic of the testing day. We asked them to do a lot. But we had our baseline measurement, so they completed our creativity task before taking the drug. We then gave them the drug. During peak drug effects, we looked to see what changes were going on in the brain, and then we got them out of the scanner, and afterwards they did our creativity tasks again, and then they came back 7 days later, and they did them again sober. So what did we find? Not what we thought we were going to. So on our tasks, we found that psilocybin decreased measures of divergent thinking. So people came up with less responses. So for example, when we gave them the alternate uses test, so this is really like the gold standard test in divergent thinking, you ask people to list all the things they can think of to do with a chair, with an everyday item, a bottle, a newspaper, whatever. And we see, and I'll explain this graph because I know it's a hell of a graph. But psilocybin is purple, placebo is pink. On the x-axis, we have baseline, acute, follow-up. We have the distribution of the data, the box plots, and the raw data points. And what we see is that compared to baseline and compared to placebo, psilocybin reduced number of responses, number of ideas people put down on what they could do with a chair. In regards to convergent thinking, we also found a reduction. This we expected because this we have found in the past. So when we gave them a task called the picture concept test, so here we show them groups of pictures and we ask them to make associations between these pictures. And there is a logical association. There's a correct answer. They're primed for this. So we say you'll see animals, plants, etc. So here the logical association would be the dog and cat. And we see that they came up with less correct responses under psilocybin compared to baseline and compared to placebo. It also looks like we see a reduction 7 days later. This was surprising, but yeah, actually what I think we more so see is we see a learning effect in the placebo group. So we don't give any responses. We don't tell them whether they're doing well or not in this test, but it looks like the more you do this test, the better you get. So it seems that psilocybin blocks this learning effect because they still showed an enhancement 7 days later, but it was less than the placebo group. So it's a shame, but we got it. At the same time, people reported feeling more creative. So they had more insights, they had more original thoughts, not on our tasks, I want to say. This was just throughout the testing day. So they said they had more insights into connections that had previously puzzled them, and they had very original thoughts after psilocybin compared to placebo. So we asked them at the end of the testing day to think back throughout the day. 7 days later, we found one effect, a moderate effect, but it was significant. So when we asked them to, again, do the alternate uses test, so what are all the things you can do with a chair, we see that after psilocybin, people came up with more new ideas than they did compared to baseline, compared to placebo. So for this, what we did is after they wrote down all their ideas, we asked them to go through and mark the ones that were completely new. So they've never thought to do this with a chair before. They've never seen it in a movie or heard it in a song or whatever. These were completely new. And there we see an enhancement. Any questions so far? Yeah. Yeah, so I'll come to this point exactly. It is a shame we didn't ask them how they think they performed on those tasks. I have a feeling if we did ask them, they would think they performed very badly, actually. So this was just throughout the testing day when they were left to be by themselves and we weren't harassing them, throwing them in front of the computer and making them write on a piece of paper. But I will come to that point. It's a very good point. Yeah.
So what was the characteristic of
yeah, so the novelty aspect here. So we asked people to complete the alternate uses test again. So list all the things you can do with the chair. And then after, because that's a timed task. So after their time is done, we ask them to go through and just to indicate how many responses they came up with and which responses that were completely new. So then we have a sum score. So on baseline, you had 0 new ideas, acutely you had 0, and at follow-up you had 3, like this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
Can you explain how to?
Yeah. Every reviewer I've sent this to. So this is a distribution of the data. Yeah, so then what you see are the box plots here. So the line in the middle is the median, and then we have the raw data points. These dots are the raw data points, and then the line in between. So it's a rain cloud plot. The line in between is just connecting within the group, so you can see better. So just trying to show any form of data visualization that anybody would like, whether they want the raw data points or the distribution. Yeah, I hope that helps. Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, if I go to some and if I'm nervous, I have to do this balance. Somehow
Yeah. So indeed. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So the question is rightfully said that if you are nervous or experiencing feelings of anxiety, creativity can go down. So what did we do to ensure that participants in the trial were not anxious and that this didn't impair their creativity? And that's a very good question. So what we did is we had a preparation session. So this was meeting with the participants before any drugs are involved and talking them through every step of the way. So very detailed, explaining what's going to happen, what we're asking them to do, so there were no surprises. They also got to know us, we got to know them, and also make sure that they know if there's any part of the study they don't want to participate in, they don't have to do it. If they don't want to list all the things they can do with the chair, fine, they can lay on the couch and close their eyes. So that was part of, building up this relationship with our participants, which I think is very important, because it is a weird setting, right? We do also take acute, and I'm not showing them now, but we take acute mood measures. So that is something we can use to control. I have looked for them. What you see generally with any psychedelic study is when the drug starts hitting people, there is kind of a little bit of an anxiety peak because something's changing, something's happening, what's going to happen. But then this goes down quite quickly. So during this time, so it's about 120 minutes later, they're in peak drug effects. They're not anxious anymore. They're fine. Our participants also have had at least one previous experience with a psychedelic. So that's a requirement for our studies. So they know what to expect. I mean, as much as you can know what to expect when taking a drug like this, but they know what the drug effects generally are. So it's my interpretation and my hope, but I think most people had fun. All right, so I'm going to go forward. Yeah, so coming back to the question, right, do psychedelics enhance creativity? It looks like we see a bit of a discrepancy, right? We see a reduction in our tasks. People report feeling more creative, and then talk about 7 days later in a minute. So we thought maybe what we are capturing with this discrepancy are the two different processing modes of creative cognition, and that would be deliberate, goal-directed creative cognition versus spontaneous creative cognition, which is usually lumped with spontaneous insights. So deliberate goal-directed creative cognition is initiated when one is focused on meeting task demands to reach a certain goal. So saying, me telling you, here is a chair, tell me everything you can do with it. This type of creative cognition is characterized as being more attention demanding. And what you see in other creativity studies without drugs is that people generally tend to search for their answers along a very structured belief system. So they take what they know about a chair and they work their way out. Sit, stand, break a window. So if we interpret our data along these lines, it would suggest that psychedelics reduce, acutely anyway, reduce this ability. And we come to this, based on what we see here. So convergent thinking is necessary for creative cognition, but this is the more rigid type of thinking, the more logical type of thinking. This is closely associated with the structured belief system. At the same time, other studies, many from the wonderful lab of Franz Vollenweider with Katrin Preller in Zurich, find that acutely psychedelics also do just impair aspects of executive functioning that are necessary to act in a deliberate, goal-directed way, right? Attention is impaired, working memory is impaired, people are impaired. So whether that is task and purity problem or not, I'm not sure, but these facets are necessary for this type of creative cognition. At the same time, psychedelics may acutely enhance spontaneous creative cognition. So spontaneous insights tend to occur in a mental state that's characterized by very unrestrained cognition, defocused attention. Here, thoughts are very random, bizarre, unfiltered. And if you're familiar with the acute effects of psychedelics, it sounds pretty synonymous actually with what people experience when they're under the influence. So to give you the words of somebody who has had this experience, they state that you can experience some of the coolest, most interesting lines of thinking, but at the same time, turning on the TV can seem like a nearly impossible obstacle. And I really like this quote because I think it nicely highlights or reflects this mismatch between this really rich internal state you can be having on a psychedelic or something else, and this discrepancy with being able to deliberately act on it. So this is acutely, but what about this long-term change? So to give you one more quote, I really like quotes, if you haven't noticed. This is from Ringo Starr, from the Beatles, again, talking about how the Beatles reportedly utilized psychedelics and also cannabis for their music. And he said that we found out very early that if you play music stoned or derelict in any way, it was really shitty music. So you'd have the drug experience and then bring that into the music later. So perhaps what we see here is this, that acutely psychedelics do induce a facet of flexible cognition. This would be spontaneous, this would not be deliberate, but perhaps this flexible state does persist in the days following the experience, and that people can utilize deliberately these thoughts they had, or utilize deliberately this flexible cognitive state when the impairing facets of the drug have worn off. And we did see a post hoc, but we did see a correlation. The more acute feelings of insights and original thoughts, the more new ideas 7 days later. So very quickly, in regards to the how, this is a very preliminary how, because here we're correlating resting state activity to task performance. This was a limitation of our study due to time constraints, but before people completed the creative tasks, they were in the scanner. And here what we did is, using independent components analysis, we isolated the 3 functional networks that are important, have been implicated in creative cognition. So this would be the default mode network. This is implicated in idea generation, which you can also think similar to divergent thinking. The executive network, this is implicated in idea evaluation. So this also closely aligns with convergent thinking. And then the salience network, which shifts the ideas back and forth between the two. And what we found, like all other psychedelic neuroimaging studies found, is we found disruptions of these normally highly organized, or disruptions of the normally highly organized activity within and between these resting state networks. So usually these networks, the brain regions within them are very highly coupled, and they're anti-correlated to the other networks. And we see under psilocybin that psilocybin reduces the connectivity of the default mode network. So the regions in the default mode network are not talking to each other as much as they usually are, while increasing connectivity between the default mode network and the salience network, and the default mode network and the executive network. And when we correlated this with the performance on our creativity tasks, we found that all of the more divergent thinking outcomes loaded on the default mode network. So the more of a disruption in the default mode network, idea generation, the less acute, deliberate creative cognition. At the same time, the more insights and originality, and this even quite strongly correlated with the 7 day later novelty scores. So the more of a reduction acutely, the more new ideas 7 days later. And we also saw that convergent thinking, so the more of an increase of between network functional connectivity between the DMN and the SEN, the more of a reduction in convergent thinking. If you have questions, I'm happy to discuss it. So to conclude about psychedelics and creativity, do psychedelics enhance creativity? Well, it looks like it's not so simple. So we see construct, divergent, convergent, and time-dependent effects, acute, subacute. Perhaps we see differences in deliberate versus spontaneous. Perhaps we see differences in subjective versus objective creativity. Maybe people just feel creative when they're not. They're under the influence of drugs that increase feelings of meaning, increase emotional states, things like this. This could be the case, and I would be happy to have this discussion with you. This is something that we're trying to establish right now. It's very hard to do, but we're doing this in a further study. In regards to the how, preliminary evidence suggests DMN involvement, but again, very preliminary. You need task-based neuroimaging while people are actually performing a creative cognition task. And there's a lot of future work in this area, one of them being assessments in clinical populations. So just very briefly coming back to the clinical side, as I stated before, people claim therapeutic relief from these changes in thought processes. They say insights, changes in perspective. So personally, I believe finding out if, how, and when psychedelics affect creativity can be very important. So if we take together the results that I just shared with you and some results I haven't had a chance to share with you, what we've done is we're building a timeline of psychedelic effect. So going from acute to the days, weeks, months following the experience. And a line of work that I would like to pursue in the future is to investigate whether these drugs open up a window of opportunity where you can selectively utilize these time-dependent effects on different aspects of creativity to increase, for example, effectiveness of psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy. So, for example, if rigid thought content, so here I'm saying rigid convergent thinking, again, convergent thinking is important in creative cognition. It's the logical side, but if that logic is off, like it is in many mental health disorders, you know, thoughts, I am terrible, the world is terrible. If you cannot escape these thoughts, that's maladaptive logic. So this is acutely increased, perhaps. Well, and then what we see are unguided, spontaneous thoughts may then give rise to new insights, changes in perspectives on current problems, but unguided, not goal-directed, right? So allowing an individual to be to themselves and let their thoughts wander might be more useful than trying to direct them in a certain manner. Yeah, so the question is, how willing are participants to do a task on the psychedelics? Willing? Yeah, so this is why we choose our doses carefully. We want a dose that elicits the characteristic psychedelic state, but we don't want full-blown ego dissolution where they're laying on the couch and can't communicate with us, right? That's not the purpose. That's not our research question. So our dose is moderate, and it's a dose that they're able to perform these tasks. They are impaired. Right? As I said, their attention is everywhere. Still, they might not be so interested in some of these tasks, but they do complete them. Yeah. Can you what?
Can you explain the criteria for measuring the objective creativity?
Yes, so the criteria for measuring objective creativity. So on our tasks, what we use we assess our fluency and originality. So for example, if I ask you, what is everything you can do with a chair? Fluency is the amount of ideas you come up with. So just a numerical sum of the ideas you come up with. Originality is how unique are those ideas compared to everybody else in the study. So we take everybody's response, we compare it to everybody else's response, and we can calculate, okay, 10 people said you can, I don't know, do whatever with a chair. Then we get a numerical score on how original is that idea. And then we can also assess novelty. So if the ideas they generated were completely new. That's a bit more subjective because we are asking them if it's completely new. We have no way to objectively know if it's completely new, but that's the best we have. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so the question is, do we have any data, or have we investigated whether baseline creativity predicts psychedelic-induced changes in creativity? Yeah, well, I mean, the data we have is within and between subjects. So the within is you're comparing everybody's score to themselves. So if they were already high, then we see where that goes. We haven't distinguished the groups, so to look to see maybe in general, we see a reduction in number of ideas generated, but if we would take only the high scores from baseline, yeah, I haven't looked into that, to be honest. Indeed, of course, individuals who are generally more creative will talk about creativity more, but this is, yeah, I mean, everybody does, well, everybody, many people who take psychedelics do report at least this insight aspect. So this insight aspect, that the spontaneous creative cognition is on the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness scale. So this is the gold standard to assess changes in cognition or consciousness with psychedelics. So it's such an integral part that it's actually already embedded within that questionnaire. But again, it's an actual creative. It's a good question. Okay, where was I? So acutely, we see these changes, and then perhaps subacutely, we do see in the studies I showed you and some others I did not, increased, perhaps goal-directed, deliberate creative cognition. So this could be a time, for example, where patients do come back to their therapist, they talk about the insights or different perspectives that they gained under the psychedelic, they can integrate this, and if they're still in this flexible state, perhaps they can come up with new coping strategies for what's going on in their life, or they can start to solidify those new perspectives that are perhaps more adaptive. And if we look at it in a timeline frame, what we see here is that, okay, this integration aspect should be the morning after, 7 days after, at least 1 month later is too late. 37 minutes. So I'm going to flip topic. This is a lot more brief. So as I said, my umbrella of flexible cognition is very large. And under this, I'm including social cognition. And I do include it for a reason. And that's because a creative, flexible cognition has been suggested to be a prerequisite for basic components of social cognition like empathy, which makes a bit of sense if you think about it, right? In order to be able to take the perspective of somebody else, you need some imagination, you need some flexibility here. So social cognitive processes are processes which underlie how we think about, perceive, and act towards others. And one basic component of this that I will talk more about today is empathy. So empathy is also a multi-component construct, so it's never easy. It consists of cognitive empathy, which is the ability to take somebody else's perspective to understand the emotional state they're in, and emotional empathy, which is being able to feel what another person is feeling. And this is, of course, an extremely useful process to have, right? So empathy promotes pro-social behaviors in our families and our societies, and the ability to recognize the emotional state of others in our personal lives can make our personal lives a whole lot easier as well. And this is a hallmark of seemingly all mental health disorders are disruptions in social cognitive processes. So psychedelics, it has been repeatedly found that a single administration of a psychedelic drug induces subjective effects such as increases in trust and connectedness, bonding, openness, communication, and reductions in fear to be close to each other, and reductions of vulnerability. There's also actually in the psychedelic world, which the modern psychedelic world is not super big, There have been quite a few studies assessing the effect a single administration of a psychedelic has on various cognitive processes. So I don't know if you can read it very well. But here it's been found across different psychedelics that they enhance emotional empathy, so people feel more for others. It's a bit of a mix, yeah. Yep. I'll get to that, the latter part, but this is acute. Yeah, a good question. So cognitive empathy is a bit of a mixed bag. Some studies show no effect, some show reductions in cognitive empathy, so the ability to recognize another person's emotional state, particularly for negative emotions. Some studies have found reductions in social rejection sensitivity. So when you ask people to complete a task in which they think that they're being excluded from, they report being less hurt by it. LSD has been found to increase social influence processing. So in this task, they showed pictures and they asked people to rate how much they liked the picture. And then they showed pictures of somebody else's rating. And then they came back and said, do you change your rating? And they found that when people were under the influence of LSD, they were more likely to change their rating, as long as it was already similar to their previous one. Enhancements in sexual and romantic behaviors, etc. So this is all acute. We are very interested in if these effects last. And here we focused on empathy. So again, going back to the retreats and the ceremonies, we've been to a lot. And here we investigated different drugs. So we investigated the influence of ayahuasca, but also psilocybin. So psilocybin, or psilocin actually, is the psychoactive component of magic mushrooms. These were truffle retreats because we have a funny rule in the Netherlands that a mushroom that grows above the ground is illegal, but a truffle that grows beneath the ground is not illegal, but they both contain psilocybin. So there are a lot of truffle retreats in the Netherlands, and we went to a lot of them. And we asked people to complete our empathy tasks before they took the drug, 24 hours after they took the drug, and 7 days later. And we used something called the multifaceted empathy test, and this is what all of these other acute studies that I just mentioned showed too. And before I explain it to you, I want to ask you to do it. So I show you a picture of somebody in emotional state, and your job is to indicate which emotional state you think this person is in. So the options are desperate, stubborn, guilty, and tired. I'll give you a second to think. So who thinks desperate? Who thinks stubborn? Guilty? Tired? You did twice. The answer is desperate. We have another young child, and we have hilarious, loving, pleased, and exuberant. Yeah, like extremely happy. Usually we show it in English, Dutch, and German. Actually, I don't know why I only kept the English. So who says hilarious? Loving? Pleased? And exuberant. Yeah, it's exuberant. So it's not easy. Next, we have the same picture, and what I ask you is how much do you feel for this person? So we ask our participants on a scale from 1 being very little to 9 very much. So I'll just go through in odd increments. So who says 1? 3? 5? 7? 9? Okay, there's no right answer here. And how much does this picture arouse you? So of course, this is not sexual arousal, right? This is physiological arousal. How much does it make you feel, right? So we have 1 to 9. So how much does this make you feel? 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Yeah? Okay, so this is a multifaceted empathy test. By asking these questions, we can assess cognitive empathy for both positive and negative emotions. So that is, what emotional state are they in? We can assess emotional empathy, and this we can even break down into more. So we have how much concern do you feel for the person, or how much do you feel for the person? This is explicit emotional empathy, and implicit emotional empathy. How much does this make you feel? Yeah. And what we find, so what other studies found, acute increase in emotional empathy, maybe a reduction in cognitive empathy, we don't really know. But what we found after psilocybin and ayahuasca is the morning after, emotional empathy was still enhanced. And then 7 days later, when they did the test again, in both studies, so these are two separate publications, the arousal part, so how much does it make you feel, was still enhanced. I have a question mark next to cognitive empathy because in one study after ayahuasca, we actually found that people showed higher scores of cognitive empathy for positive pictures. So they were more able to indicate positive emotional states than they did at baseline. But I only found it in one, not two, so there's a question mark. Additionally, which I found very interesting, is in both studies, we found that the more of an increase in emotional empathy, particularly for positive emotions, the more of an increase in self-reported satisfaction with life 7 days later. So indicating that it might be related to how people are feeling after the experience. So that's, yeah. Oh, in this experiment. Yeah, but the rationale is that at least in multiple depression studies, it's been found that depression severity strongly correlates with empathic ability. So the more of a reduction in empathy, the more depressed people are. This was not a depressed sample, but we wanted to see, okay, is there a relationship here? And it was quite interesting to find it in both studies. So we were able to repeat it. So that's in healthy volunteers. What about findings from patients? I showed you the schematic before, it's probably outdated by now, but none of those studies directly assess changes in social cognition. Just one study, from Imperial College London, they were assessing psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. They interviewed patients about their experiences before they participated in the trial and after they participated in the trial. And in regards to social factors, before treatment, patients reported that they felt they had less and less in common with their peers, they felt being alone, and they also felt isolated, they craved emotional company. After the treatment, they were asked why they thought psilocybin helped them. And over half of the patients in the trial claimed significant improvements were via changes to how they connected with others. So the top quote is the same person. They stated that after the trial, they went past a bike shop, they went out off the street and said, can I hang out and help? I went there for 6 months and helped renovate his shop. So a lot different from having nothing in common with your peers and feeling very alone. And the bottom is not the same person, it's a different participant. But they stated that my wife and I went for dinner for the first time in 6 years. We were like a couple of teenagers. And on this topic, I go to my last bit here. It nicely segues into another topic of interest, which are the growing number of anecdotal reports from couples who are using psychedelics together, not just for fun, but for some therapeutic aid. And what they report is that they feel more close to each other. So it was like we could see each other's souls. They reported being able to be more vulnerable with each other. So we had this incredible deep chat that we didn't even know we wanted to have. And these are anecdotal reports from online, right? But one person reported that I was reminded how it was to first fall in love with my partner. So to summarize here, we see that a single ingestion of a psychedelic increases pro-social behavior. And we have anecdotal reports of improvements in social relationships after psychedelic use in both patients and romantic partners. There are obviously some gaps here, questions I have as well. So how? What's changing in the brain that induces these changes in social behavior? And also, this is all demonstrated between, at least the experimental studies are demonstrated between person and computer. What you just did was the MET. That is how we have assessed empathy in all these trials. That was between you and this picture on the screen. What about between two people? And finally, what is the functional outcome of this? If psychedelics enhance prosocial behavior, do you give more to charity? Do you hug your partner more? Is your relationship quality increased? So we're currently running a study trying to assess this. So we're still inviting healthy couples to come to the lab and take LSD together with their partner, and also placebo. And we want to try to answer these questions. So this is a team of amazing collaborators ranging from us at Maastricht to social neuroscientists, etc. So we're looking for 30 couples who will come in person for 4 testing days. So an acute treatment day where they receive the LSD, and a different day they receive placebo. And then they come in 2 days later. And then 4 days later, we follow up again with online questionnaires. And I'll talk you through the main tasks. But because the main question is the how. What is going on in somebody's brain on LSD that explains these increases or these changes in social behavior? And currently, studies so far have only imaged a single brain while it's viewing a non-interactive stimulus, so like the picture you just saw. So there are many reasons why we do this. We've learned a lot from this, but it's not exactly the most ecologically valid way to assess this, right? Some have even turned it social observation versus social interaction. In order to have social interaction, you need an interaction, you need 2 people, you need 2 brains. So this is why we're asking 2 people to come into the lab. We want to assess changes in brain function under LSD using an EEG hyperscanning study. So while they're interacting, we're recording from their 2 brains at the same time. And we can do a lot with this data, but one thing we're really interested in is neural synchrony. So neural synchrony is the coupling of brain-to-brain activity or oscillations. It's thought to be a neural substrate for many forms of shared verbal and nonverbal behavior, like social cooperation, empathy, affective touch. And I actually really like this. I think it's quite romantic, because when we say we feel connected with somebody, you know, their expressions, we're sharing a mind, we're on the same wavelength. And this is, we might have neuroscientific evidence to back these types of metaphors. So this is our main interest here. And this is 2 lovely interns who are piloting the study. So you see they're both set up with EEG caps. We are in a small room, but a comfortable room. It's not sterile or as sterile. There's pictures on the wall, there's a couch. There's a table in between so that they can interact with each other. So we can also stabilize them, because when you're on LSD, you move a lot. And if you do EEG, you know, moving a lot is not good. So they have chin rests so they can put their chins on. And while they're doing this, we're asking them to do certain tasks that have been previously found to elicit neural synchrony. So we want to see if LSD increases it, right? So we have a motor task, or yeah, it's more a cooperation task. We ask them to draw together on an Etch-a-Sketch. You still know what an Etch-a-Sketch is. A lot of my participants don't. But with the little dials, they draw together. And we also ask them to do tasks like empathy giving. So they go back and forth sharing both positive and negative stories, personal life stories, while their partner listens and gives support. And this is, and essentially what we're doing is we're going through this whole wheel, and we want to redo all of these tasks between 2 people, right? So for example, with empathy, this multifaceted empathy task that I shared with you, we can then ask them, okay, speaker, when you were sharing your story, how aroused did you feel? How supported did you feel from your partner? And also, we ask them to identify words that describe their feelings. So we give them adjectives that they can circle. And then we can ask the listener about their partner, how aroused do you think your partner felt? How aroused did you feel? How much concern did you feel for your partner? And we also ask them to identify their emotional state. And with this, it's a real life MET, we can assess both cognitive and emotional empathy between them, and how LSD, if it does, changes this. And then if LSD does enhance or alter neural synchrony, if it does alter pro-social behavior, we can assess functional outcomes of this. So are individuals willing to put in more effort for their partner or for other participants in the study? Are partners able to come to a resolution on topics that they don't agree upon? And finally, does this affect their relationship quality or their sexual satisfaction? So what is the functional outcome of these changes on their relationship? So I have no data, and I always feel really bad about that. So I have some quotes. So we on day 4, so 4 days after the acute treatment day, we ask them a bunch of questions, and then we give them an open box, and we say, is there anything else you would like to tell us? And this is what everybody says. Only responses after the LSD condition say, I feel so connected to them. I feel very loving and attached to my partner more than usual. I felt much closer to my partner, especially right after the drug administration day. I feel like it's brought us closer together. We've grown closer together. And this one I really like. We had one conflict since the last drug administration. While it took some time and pain to motivate ourselves enough to resolve it, the conclusion and resolution felt much more satisfactory than usual. Previously, I frequently had a feeling that something is still not right, even after coming to some sort of a resolution. Extremely preliminary, but it's nice. So to conclude, I chose to present these studies in a way that demonstrate my opinion of the modern psychedelic renaissance. So we start with an indication. We have anecdotal reports. People say my creativity is enhanced, my symptoms are reduced, I feel closer to my partner. And then we can explore these reports, right? So via naturalistic observational studies, we can take advantage of the fact that people are using these drugs in the wild and try to get indications of what's going on. And I think it's very important to have these indications, because when we have these indications, you have a justification to assess this in a more controlled, rigorous scientific setting. But to get to here is really hard, right? There's a reason why there's been a delay in this work, right? These drugs are stigmatized, they're illegal. In order to administer them to anybody, you need a lot of permits, you need a lot of money. So they're very, very difficult to do. So these some people think, I don't know, down about naturalistic observational study. It's not controlled, blah, 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 but you can learn so much before you spend a lot of money in an experimental setting. And then when you can test it in an experimental setting, you can start to explain what's going on. What are the behavioral mechanisms? What are the biological mechanisms? And then, of course, as with all science, you should replicate it. And when you replicate it, you should do it better than when it was done before, in collaboration with experts, creativity experts, social neuroscientists, etc. So I think we're here now, which is very good, and really an important step to be in, because there's a lot of hope by people that these substances are going to be, you know, the next big therapeutic aid, that they'll help a lot of people that are currently not being helped. So we need to understand if that's really the case, because there's a lot of hype now as well. So in order to do that, it's good we're here, because I think that this is the level where we can try to distinguish between the two. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take more questions.